Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'll be painting this loose winter scene. I've been practicing little by little to be more loose when painting landscapes, and I'm not sure if you've seen my shorts, but I've been having fun playing with muted winter tones, so I decided to try to paint a larger piece today where I can include a bit more variety of textures and color. I started out by of course masking the sides of my paper, and since the tape here is fairly thin, I'm just using washi tape. You can also use masking tape. I ended up using some clips as well to lock the position of the paper. I'm going to paint this freehand, so I'm going to go straight to the colors. This is Sepia by Holbein, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Vermilion by Holbein, and Ultramarine Finest by Schmincke. For some added effects, I'm also going to use a bit of table salt. Let's begin to paint. I'm using my large flat brush here and I'm somewhat wiggling my brush to dampen the top part of my paper. What I'm trying to do is to create a barrier where the wet paint can't travel, which is on the dry surface. And I want it to be a snowy day, so I imagined a little bit of an uneven snowy pile in front. Next, I switched to a round brush. This is also fairly large, so it can hold a lot of paint and water. And I'm going to create a gray mixture from Sepia and Ultramarine Finest. I know it's a bit hard to see the damp surface on camera here, but you'll see how the paint reacts to it. So here I'm just going to apply it and just watch how the paint blooms out, creating all these abstract shapes. I'm also somewhat creating that barrier again with the wet paint, and I also want to pair this up with different tones of browns or muted tones, so you can see me adding some vermilion here for a more warm tone instead of that very muted gray. I also want to create the same thing on the right hand side, but again I want to change the tone slightly, so I'm going to add some yellow ochre this time. I also want to add this muted brown on the left hand side, and I'm going to add it on top of the areas that I've already painted earlier, so it looks like there are taller trees at the back. This tree looks a bit too flat for my liking, so I just use clean water to extend the height. After this, I add a bit of vermilion. This is just pure vermilion that is going to somewhat mix into the color that I've already previously painted with. My brush was still a bit too dirty, but it's okay to get a little bit of that color in the sky. But next, I'm going to use a thin consistency of Ultramarine Finest mixed with a bit of the gray that I've already had on my palette, and I just place it very lightly for the sky, just letting the paint move on its own. For extra texture, I decided to sprinkle a little bit of table salt on top of the larger trees, and I'm just going to see how it reacts. It usually takes a while for the salt to absorb the paint, so I'm just going to let it sit for a while. Since I painted on a damp surface, the color will fade quite a lot as it dries, so I'm going to add more of that brown mixture from Ultramarine Finest, Vermilion, and Sepia. I'm painting with a really thick consistency, and because the surface has settled a little bit more now, the paint won't travel too fast. I don't mind if this thick consistency covers the previous trees that I've painted, because what I'm trying to create is a layered effect. I want the trees which are in front to look darker than the ones at the back, so it looks kind of hazy. After waiting a while, I felt like the salt wasn't doing much because maybe there wasn't enough pigments to move around, so I'm just going to add a little bit more on the areas that I sprinkled salt. I want to add a stream to this composition, so again I'm starting with just dampening the surface. This time I'm trying to dampen the area of the stream, leaving a barrier for the snowy parts on the left and right hand side. I'm going to start with the color of the sky, which is a mix of the ultramarine fineness with the gray mixture that I've had on my palette. Then I'm going to paint it on the edges of the stream. Next, I'm going to try to replicate what I painted as the trees on the stream, so it's somewhat of a mirrored reflection. I'm starting with the gray, painting it in the light consistency, and I'm also going to add some warmer browns as well. Once the reflection of the trees at the back has kind of settled and dried off a little bit more, but still damp, I'm going to add the thicker consistency paint in front of the lighter reflections. With the brown that's left on my brush, I'm just going to use it to paint the edges of the stream so it looks like a muddy part of the snow. And I'm also going to actually darken it a little bit further using the same mixture as before. I felt like this was a bit too brown, so I muted the color by adding more blue. Let's move on to the next step where I'll be painting the snowy part. I'm basically going to use the same colors as before. I'm going to make it as muted as possible, but this time I'm only going to stick with a really thin consistency so the snow still looks white, and I also want to make sure to leave out some white from the paper. The pile of snow looks quite high on the left, and I'm trying to figure out how to separate it from the flat snow near the stream. I'm trying to just paint diagonal lines to imagine how the hill rolls down, which I'm going to again paint very lightly, and I'm also going to do more or less something similar on the right hand side. By the way, for this painting, since I did paint fairly quickly, I think it took me only around 30 minutes or so. This is mostly in real time. I just made some minimal cuts because one stroke can mean a lot for these sort of loose paintings. Sometimes I also get comments asking how frequent I clean my brush and things, which I'm usually unable to show if I don't have enough frame space for smaller paintings since I have to zoom in a bit more. So hopefully you'll get to see more of the true process here. I feel like I'm going to add a few bushes on the snow since they look too large as just a flat area. So here I'm just using a thin consistency to indicate the allocated space for now. Here is where I feel like I started adding a bit too much. I wanted to create a really light vignette on the bottom right corner, but ended up adding too much. Luckily, it was still light enough for me to spread out, and I can also balance it out with the rest of the values from other surrounding elements. I didn't really like how the snow looked. It looks like it's kind of jumping out of the landscape here in this area. So I decided to bring the plants forward. I started by smudging it, and then I'm going to use a slightly darker value to just paint and continue it down. I feel like I want to break off the density of the plants because there's just so much dark value here, so I decided to sprinkle some salt as well. Overall, I feel like the composition looks a little bit too warm and red, so I decided to bring some muted green in there using a mix of Ultramarine Finest and Yellow Ochre. I'm also going to use this color mixture to paint the bush on the snow on the left-hand side as well. After this, I want to add some finer details using a thick consistency and also a dry brush load to get those really nice textures. But before then, I want to make sure everything's completely dry. I realized that the snow on this area on the right looks a little bit too flat. So here I'm adding those diagonal lines to give it a little bit more of the slanted texture. Okay, so next I'm going to switch to my Dagger brush. This has fairly soft bristles and it also comes to a very fine point. The bristles are a little bit longer on one side, which makes it quite randomized when I'm creating lines, especially if I'm using a dry brush. So here I'm creating a dark gray from a mix of Vermilion, Sepia, and Ultramarine Finest. Using a very thick consistency, you can see the point or the tip of my bristles, and I'm just going to wiggle it around, letting the flat side also drag along the snow, so some areas look a little bit more textured from the dry brush. I'm trying to play with the weight of the lines, making sure that everything looks natural and uneven. I also realized though that I'm probably using too dark of a consistency here for certain areas, especially compared to the really light background, but I'm just going to keep going for now and see how I can balance it later on. Okay, so this is when I realized I'm going to just smudge some of the paint, making them lighter, using a clean damp brush to also soften some of the edges so the area at the back doesn't look as sharp as the front. Here I realized I haven't brought across the reflection, so I'm adding the reddish brown, and after this I'm also going to add that yellow green in front. Now I'm going to go back to the same dark gray, or basically black, and I'm going to paint on the details on the right hand side as well. I realized that since we're looking mostly from the right hand side, the edges of the snow near the stream won't be as visible as on the left side, so I'm going to limit the amount. There's way too much contrast between the black and the white of the snow on the side of the stream, so I'm going to use a really thin consistency of whatever brown I already have on my palette, and I'm just going to smudge the edges, softening some of them and just flicking my brush to create random textures. Next, I'm going to add the fun details for the trees and branches in the background as well as the foreground. I'm going to use the same brush for this, making sure to use the thicker side for the stem of the tree and using the tip for the finer branches. You can also use a size 0 brush or a liner brush to paint the fine lines if you don't have the same type of brush I'm using here. Whenever you're trying to paint delicate lines, make sure to use a really light load close to a dry brush load so the paint doesn't travel too fast out of your bristles. This way you can control it much better, almost like a pen. Here I'm using a really thick consistency so the lines can still be visible even though it's very thin. I'm just going to use the same method to paint all the dry branches all across the composition. At some point though, as I was changing the angle when I was filming, I forgot to press record. So tada, it's suddenly almost finished. It was actually finished, but I ended up adding a bit more detail so I can salvage the video instead of just randomly ending it. You see that I like to play with lighter values as well, even though I'm using the dry brush load, depending if I want certain textures to look a bit lighter and delicate, but I just basically try to find the right balance between the values in general. By playing with the values of the bushes or the branches, it'll look like it has a bit more depth, so you can see the lighter branches that I previously painted look like it's further away or it's just placed behind the ones that I painted with the darker value. Just some finishing touches for the foreground, and I'm also going to smudge the background so there won't be too much detail fighting for our attention. And once I'm done, I'm going to unmask and reveal the painting. I'm just going to make sure everything's completely dry before taking off the masking tape. So here's the final look. I mean, it's not the best. I'm not really happy with some of the branches in the foreground, but in terms of looseness, I think I'm starting to embrace it a bit more. But let me know what you think in the comments. I would be very happy to hear any advice. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing for more. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!